Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by our good friends at ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association, and ASA works very hard to support animal studies scholars in Australia, in New Zealand, in Australasia more generally, and around the world. Now, ASA is hosting the 2019 conference, the biannual ASA conference, and it's going to be in New Zealand. So start thinking about, first of all, what paper you want to present, and also start thinking about how you're going to get your cash together so you can get over there. It's going to be an absolutely fantastic conference. So check out ASA online at Facebook and at their website, and also why not become a member? Membership subs helps the organisation that helps animal studies scholars. So this episode of Knowing Animals is coming to you from beautiful Edinburgh. Now I'm here to attend a international public management conference. So some of you might be aware that my other research area is in welfare to work and service privatisation and lots of things to do with public policy. But wherever I am around the world, I always try and grab an opportunity to speak to an animal studies scholar. And this week, I'm very lucky to be joined by Andrew Gardiner. Now, I think, did I spell your name incorrectly there on the script?
There is an I. I don't know how to spell my own name. Yeah, there's an I after the D, I and E.
Oh, beg your pardon, but did I pronounce it correctly?
You pronounced it perfectly.
Oh, wonderful. Now, Andrew is Senior Lecturer in Veterinary Medicine at the University of Edinburgh, and today we're going to discuss his article, The Dangerous Women of Animal Welfare, How British Veterinary Medicine Went to the Dogs. And this article appeared in Social History of Medicine in 2014. So welcome to the podcast, Andrew.
Thank you.
So Andrew, why this article? How was this inspired?
So I did a kind of mid-career PhD. I worked as a vet for 15 years and I decided I wanted to explore various aspects of veterinary medicine, animal welfare and ethics in a bit more detail. So I was lucky enough to get a Wellcome Trust scholarship to do a master's and then a PhD in the history of British veterinary medicine, particularly looking at the interrelationships with animal welfare. And that paper came out of the PhD studies that I did. Is kind of the best bit for the PhD. And I was very lucky when I was researching it because I found what all historians kind of dream of, which is a lot of source material which really hadn't been looked at before. It was in the basement of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons in London. I knew there was a story to tell about the People's Dispensary for the Sick Animals of the Poor, which is the organisation I wrote about. I knew there was a story to tell about that and the vets. But I didn't realise I'd stumble upon this great range of source material, and so that's what really caused me to write that paper. And I guess what it's doing is it's slightly disrupting the usual story that vets have been told or told themselves about the development of companion animal treatment.
Yes, so the source material is just fascinating. As you say, it's an absolute goldmine. The bits that you cite in detail is just, it's incredible that such things were recorded, let alone thought. And I was just saying to Andrew before we started how much I enjoyed it. I love veterinary history. It's one of my kind of little hobby passions. So for the benefit of listeners who maybe aren't so engaged with veterinary history, can you start by telling us about the role horses played in the advent or development of veterinary medicine?
Yeah, well, I suppose horses were the key species. They were the noble and useful animal that vets associated themselves with, and that kind of made the veterinary profession a noble and useful profession. So there was a kind of metaphorical thing going on there. And they were the credible animal species to treat. And, you know, horses as other animal historians have shown, cover all aspects of human society. You know, you have your humble cart horse at the bottom end and your elite thoroughbred at the top end, and so you've kind of got a horse class structure which mimics or sits alongside human social class structure. So they're a very significant companion species and working animal, and they were the species that vets identified mainly with. And the period I'm writing about, which was 1920s, 1930s, between the war, what was happening then was, of course, that the horse was beginning to disappear from society, or at least the writing was on the stable wall that the horse was going to disappear. And that threw the veterinary profession into a bit of a crisis, because they didn't know what they were going to do when horses went away. And there was big campaigns to bring back the horse, and people were kind of in denial, and they said that this new fad of motor vehicles would just pass because it was impractical. But I think they also, maybe, as I say, saw the writing on the wall and began to worry very deeply about what the future of the veterinary profession would be, if any.
Yeah. So we know that vet students today enrolling at a university such as yours, many of them will become small animal practitioners, perhaps even most of them. So what happened? How did the shift, or what does your paper contribute to our understanding of the shift from being really focused on horses to being more small animal practitioners?
Well, I think it tells part of the story, and the reason I'm saying that is because I've just reviewed a book for Society and Animals by Hilda Keane, which is called The Great Cat and Dog Massacre, and it's about a massacre of cats and dogs that occurred in Britain at the start of the Second World War. So, and that's another bit of that story that has needed filled in for a while. So mine tells a bit of it, and I think what it does is that, generally speaking, people thought that vets turned to companion animals as a kind of post-war thing, when people started to live in towns and cities more, when they became distanced from animals, when the family began to break up and people became isolated. There's a narrative that goes that so companion animals began to enter our lives, and we were kind of getting back in touch with nature, and they were giving companionship to smaller families or broken up families. And that kind of coincided with the time where vets started to treat companion animals more. But what I found when I was researching that period was that actually companion animal treatment didn't start after the war. In fact, it started before the war, well before the war. It's just that it wasn't being carried out by vets. It was carried out largely by animal welfare organisations, who had kind of moved into practical animal welfare, at least this is the way I see it, practical hands-on animal welfare, after being, in the Victorian period, the sort of organisations or the sort of people who would be anti-vivisectionists and so on, that type of activity. So in the period I'm looking at, that sort of campaigning was less prominent, but what seemed to emerge was this practical animal welfare, hands-on animal welfare of treating animals. And just the extent of the treatment was known at the time. It was very controversial at the time, but somehow in the history that we tell ourselves about companion animal veterinary medicine, it kind of got lost, and we forgot just the extent of animal treatment that was going on, and how controversial and how political it all was when it was taking place.
So your paper is a story about the veterinary profession, but it's also a story about animal welfare and animal welfare organisations. And then it's also a story about women and their role in influencing what happened. So can you say a little bit about what these animal groups were doing? And in particular, I mean, what was the level of treatment? For instance, would they desex a cat, for example?
Generally, not so much what we would call neutering, because actually in the period I'm writing about, that wasn't a common procedure. That's a kind of invention, if you like, of responsible pet ownership, in quotes. Responsible companion animal ownership, we would say now. you get your animal neutered. In the period I'm writing about, that wasn't so prominent at all. In fact, there's a whole other story to tell about neutering and the kind of reasons behind that and ethics and all the rest of it. So it wasn't so much that, but they were doing what you would consider to be regular treatment. Many of them were probably better at it than the vets, who were still largely preoccupied with horses. So these people were trained by the charities themselves, and particularly this one charity, People's Dispensary for the Sick Animals of the Poor, which still is around today. I worked for them for 8 years. But they were very different in the 20s and 30s. And the name does have a kind of revolutionary sound to it. And they were quite revolutionary and very antagonistic towards the veterinary profession. And it was organised by one lady, Maria Dicken, who I write a bit about. So she trained her own staff. She bypassed the veterinary establishment and set up her own vet school, in effect, it was. And legally at that time, there was no restriction on who could treat animals. So she teamed up with a Harley Street doctor, and they developed a course in companion animal veterinary medicine, which was probably better than anything that was being taught in the vet schools at the time. And certainly the level of treatment that her staff carried out, the clinics were so busy, they had exposure to so much animal disease that they became, probably by the standards of the day, very good at it, indeed.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the early days, certainly vets were very enthusiastic about applying fire to animals, or to horses in particular. That was seemed to be one of their main remedies. But I mean, it took a while to become more scientific, didn't it? The veterinary profession. It was a slow burn towards that being more professional, as with the human medicine as well. So if we could say something then about the kind of the gender aspect to your article. So one of the kind of things that I think you're trying to disrupt is this notion that then either companion animals become prominent and therefore women are attracted to veterinary medicine, or that women are attracted to veterinary medicine and suddenly small animals are attractive. I mean, it seems to be that one woman is driving a very useful service, and then men are trying to somehow occupy that space once they see the writing on the wall and that it will be, a future for the discipline.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, although I focused on one woman, Maria Dicken, because of particularly what I was writing about, there were many others in that time in animal welfare. In fact, if you look at a lot of the UK animal welfare charities, such as the Brook, which works internationally with working equids, the Donkey Sanctuary, and many of those organisations, they tended to be set up by middle-class women, a bit like Maria Dicken, who maybe had some independent means and set out to bring about changes. The point you said, I mean, and I kind of query that in the article, that narratives that women caused small animal practice or companion animal practice because they joined the veterinary profession, or on the other hand, the small animal turn drew more women in to veterinary practice. They are not really evidence-based. So they're the kind of explanation that can sound quite sensible, but actually there isn't any proper history done on that to unpick those stories. Although Julie Hipperson has recently written on women veterinary surgeons, and she's began to show just how complex that story was. I mean, in my paper, I don't touch on that aspect so much. I'm more focused on the actual interplay between the organisations. But it was very clear that the early women who joined the veterinary profession after the Sex Discrimination Removal Act in 1919, they didn't particularly want to be companion animal vets. In fact, the first woman veterinary surgeon considered herself to be a large animal vet. She treated horses and farmhouse. She also treated dogs and cats, but she didn't identify as that. And when you look at women who were advertising for posts, they weren't saying they wanted to work in companion animals. They wanted to do the whole thing as vets. They may have ended up largely working in companion animals because that was the only work they could get. Some of them had a terrible time of it because people just wouldn't take them seriously and employ them. But actually their initial motivations seemed to be to treat all species. And the other thing that should be said about these early women, most of them were absolutely brilliant students. They tended to win all the prizes. So academically, they were right up there. The transition to establishing themselves in practice and running small businesses, and that's stuff that Julie really goes into in such a good way, is part of that story. So it's not just a history of women vets, it's women as small business operators in terms of veterinary medicine. Fascinating.
I just love that quote in there. I think it was from, the Royal College or some senior veterinary group, peak body, and they're saying, these women, these childless women with their love of dogs.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
So normally it's cats, but obviously it took a while for the cat thing to kick in. And originally it was dogs.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they obviously did a service to the veterinary profession, identifying another avenue of, revenue and work and all the rest of it.
Yeah, well, it came around that way. As I say, I still don't believe that women caused it in any way. For example, another thing I mentioned, the small animal group, the British Small Animal Veterinary Association, was set up by a group of men who saw it as a kind of business opportunity. Yeah. There were a couple of women involved in it, but I think that the complete story of women in the veterinary profession is a very interesting one, and it's still not being told. Of course, now 80% of our year groups are women. So it's an ongoing story. The profession is very largely orientated towards women, and some people are worried about that. But if you take a longer historical view, you just see the pendulum slightly swung in the other way. That's what's happened.
Well, Andrew, I ask everyone who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Sure. Yeah.
So can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yeah, that would be Peter Singer's book, which I read, I suppose, in... it must have been when I started at vet school in the 1980s. Yeah.
So Animal Liberation?
Yes, yeah.
Popular answer.
Yes, I guess. Well, maybe of my generation. I think that's the thing.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Well, I think for that, I was thinking about that, and I think when I was a vet student, I wrote an essay or article. It was part of a competition that was run by an organisation called the Centre for Animal Welfare Studies, CAUSE. I don't think it's existing now. And that group was set up by a vet in the UK who regularly wrote provocative letters into the veterinary press, and people got very angry with them. But he was a really independent thinker. He's a practicing vet who worked in London, and he was interested in animal welfare issues, and he frequently lambasted the veterinary profession for not being proactive enough and not questioning things. And so he set up this essay competition, and it was about the title you had to write to was something along the lines of reconciling human needs and wants with animal needs and wants. And so that was the first time I kind of tried to write anything like that. So I would consider that. I don't know if you'd call it a piece of scholarship. It did win the prize, but I don't know how many people entered. Maybe I was the only one.
Early scholarship, we'll call it. No, I think that counts absolutely. So if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Yeah, that is a difficult one because, I get very influenced by anything I've just read. And recently, a branch of the political animal group, which has been up to now based in London and Dublin, has started in Edinburgh. Tom Jeffries, who's an art writer and critic, has started it. So we meet every month and we read a classic animal studies paper suggested by someone in the group. And the last one we've just read was Eduardo Cohn's anthropological study, How Dogs Dream.
Oh, wonderful.
So at the moment, that one, I'm thinking about that all the time. And because it was really good, and the discussion, as always in these things, is what actually opens you up to the possibilities of the paper. Donna Haraway, obviously, I really enjoy her writing, particularly because her relationship with animals and the presence of animals is so upfront in everything she writes and says. And I enjoy her style of writing and what she's telling us. And also John Berger too. I run a course in Edinburgh called Making Animal Studies with Andrea Rowe, who's at Edinburgh College of Art. And it's not primarily a reading course, but we do take certain readings every year. And Why Look at Animals is always one that we use. And I find that always benefits from being reread. It's kind of very crystalline prose, very clear, and yet it seems to be very much an opening up sort of piece that seems to be as relevant now as it was to when he wrote it. There's a fair historical element in it. He does a kind of bit of historiography as well, but I think the ideas that are put forward in that paper, so that's 3 at least.
A lot of people try to wriggle around the one requirement. So you're in good company yet again. What's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
So I think I feel quite strongly about this with the sort of scholarship, links between scholarship and advocacy. And I think the most important thing they can do, and this is whatever discipline they're working in, whether it's sciences or humanities, is not treat animals as tools or metaphors, but actually as agents and sentient beings. And I say I think that relates no matter what discipline you're in. So to think of them as agents and fellow mortals, as the poet Robert Burns called the mouse in his poem, and rather than as things that are good to think with.
Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think to try and figure in consideration and kind of compassion at every stage, because I think often it is there. It's just that so much of what's going on with animals is removed from our everyday experience that we can kind of forget about it. And so it's kind of related to the last question, I guess. Just to stop and think about them and think about the ways that we are relating to them, and also to be rational about it, and to realize that the species difference that we kind of impose on animals is really irrelevant in terms of sentience, and so that to treat animals symmetrically, that of different species. So to give all animals, try and give them the same level of consideration we would to the animals we know best, which is generally our companion animals.
Wonderful. Well, you'll love my book, Andrew, Animals, Equality and Democracy. So what are you working on next?
So there's a couple of things. Of course, a lot of my work, I work at the vet school and I teach veterinary clinical subjects. So I'm a lot of my day-to-day work is teaching vet students how to hopefully be good vets. And so I do a lot of general teaching in small animal subjects. I teach a little bit of ethics and welfare, and I do course in curriculum development and all that sort of stuff is centred around the veterinary course. So that sits alongside the other kind of my research kind of work, which is what the animal studies would fit into. So the next thing, which I was literally working on just before I came here this morning, is there's a book going to be published by De Gruyter, edited by Mika Roscher and colleagues, and Brett Mizell as well, called Historical Animal Studies, and Handbook of Historical Animal Studies. And I was very honoured to be asked by Mika if I would write something on the history of veterinary medicine. I've been out to Cassel and given a paper there. And so I obviously agreed very thankfully when she asked me that, and then sat down and started it a couple of weeks ago and realised just how difficult it's going to be. So the deadline's the end of June. So I have started on it, and I'm now just kind of working out how I'm going to tackle this thing. So there's that, and our course Making Animal Studies is just coming to an end, and we're going to be marking the submissions for that. So that's Andrea and I. So that will take up quite a bit of time. And another thing in the offing is we've got in human geography, we've got quite here in Edinburgh, we've got an interest in animal studies, and there's a conference coming up in June on elitism and kind of bourgeois attitudes to animal welfare. And fortunately, I submitted an abstract for that, and I'm looking forward to putting that together. That will actually be a bit more empirical kind of stuff, because I'm speaking about a clinic I run with our students in Edinburgh for homeless people and their companion animals. So there'll be a certain bit of theoretical stuff in it, but it's mainly just talking about that clinic and explaining how it's come about and what we do. So that should be relatively easy to prepare that one, I think.
So you're busy, to sum up.
Yeah.
How can people find out more about your work?
I suppose, I try and add everything to my Research Explorer page. So there's a portal called Edinburgh Research Explorer, which is the university's hub, if you like. And if you just type my name into that, then it gives you my staff page. And I do try and add things to that as and when I do them.
Wonderful. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal study scholars about their work. Now, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or you can also like us at Facebook at Knowing Animals. Have you left a review on iTunes? Do you know I check them regularly? I notice that there are a lot more people listening than there are reviewing. iTunes reviews make it easier for other people to find the podcast, so please leave a review if you've enjoyed this episode or any other episodes. My name's Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.